6 months after Harkin's Ridge, the galaxy was whispering. Not in the open halls of the Galactic Commons, where diplomats traded polite words and pretended everything was fine, but in the back channels, the intelligence briefings, the classified meetings behind locked doors. Every major species had analysts working on the same question, and the question was simple. How had 400 ordinary human soldiers held off 40,000 Dravani for 3 days? The Dravani were asking themselves the same question, and they did not like the answers they were finding. So they did what empires have always done when they suffer an embarrassment. They looked for someone weaker to hit. The Kiva were perfect targets. They were a peaceful amphibious species who lived on a wet, misty world called Kiva Prime. They had no army. They had no warships. They had survived in the galaxy by being useful to everyone and threatening to no one. Their trade networks supplied rare medicines and biological compounds that dozens of species depended on, and that had always been enough to keep them safe. Until now. The Dravani wanted Kiva Prime for its resources, but more than that, they wanted a victory. A clean, easy conquest that would remind the galaxy that the hegemony was still powerful. The Kiva could not fight back. It would be simple. Except the Kiva had recently signed a mutual defense agreement with Earth. Captain Nora Ellis stood on the bridge of the Terran cruiser Steadfast and read the orders from command. She was 41, lean, with gray streaks in her dark hair, and the kind of face that did not waste time on expressions it did not need. She had been in the Terran Navy for 19 years, and she had learned that the galaxy was not a kind place for species that could not protect themselves. 2 battalions of the 14th Terran Infantry, said Lieutenant Rick Saldana, handing her the details. He was her executive officer, tall and dark-haired, with a habit of chewing his lip when the news was bad. Right now, he was chewing it hard. 3,000 soldiers. Regulars. And the Dravani? 60 legions. 200,000 troops, give or take. Nora looked at him. Rick looked back. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that the math was even worse than Harkin's Ridge. Get the transports ready, Nora said. We leave in 6 hours. On Kiva Prime, the mist hung low over the marshlands as the human transports descended. The Kiva gathered to watch. Hundreds of amphibious beings with wide dark eyes and smooth blue-green skin standing in the shallow water near their capital city. They moved with a fluid grace that made the humans look clumsy by comparison. But there was fear in the way they held themselves, a tightness in their postures that even an alien species could recognize. Their elder leader, Thovan, met the human commanders at the landing zone. He was old by Kiva standards, broad-shouldered for his species, and he studied the arriving soldiers with an expression that mixed hope with doubt. 3,000, he said quietly, against 200,000. Sergeant First Class Katie Boone was close enough to hear him. She was 31, calm-faced, with sharp brown eyes, and the steady posture of someone who had spent 9 years in the infantry and had learned to carry its weight without letting it show. She had read the briefings on the transport. She also knew that numbers were not the only thing that mattered in a war. Elder Thovan, she said, stepping forward and giving a respectful nod. We are not planning to fight them in the open. We are going to fight them in your swamps. Thovan blinked his wide eyes. You wish to fight in the marshes? Katie looked out over the terrain. Miles of thick vegetation, winding rivers, pools of dark water. Ground that shifted and sucked at your boots with every step. It was miserable terrain for a conventional army. It was perfect terrain for soldiers who were willing to get dirty and fight ugly. Your world, your rules, Katie said. We are going to make them hate every step they take on this planet. She spent the next 2 weeks turning Kiva Prime into a trap. Her soldiers worked alongside Kiva volunteers, learning the terrain, mapping every path and waterway, identifying choke points and kill zones. They buried explosives along every road the Dravani would use. They set up hidden firing positions in the dense vegetation. They strung sensor networks across the approaches to the capital. They taught the Kiva scouts basic signaling, though most of the amphibians needed no teaching when it came to moving silently through water. They were born for it. Private First Class Andy Novak was in Katie's squad. He was 20 years old, lanky, from New Jersey, and he talked more than any 3 people combined. He was also the best shot in the platoon by a wide margin, which was the only reason Katie had not strangled him yet. "This is like camping," Andy said cheerfully, waist-deep in swamp water while helping lay a sensor cable, "except the bugs are the size of my fist, and everything smells like old fish." "Shut up and work, Novak," Katie said. "I am just saying, the bugs here are really something." Novak. "Shutting up, Sergeant." When the Dravani arrived, they came with the confidence of an army that outnumbered its enemy almost 70-1. Their dropships filled the sky. Their armored columns rolled across the landscape in formations that stretched for miles. Their commander, General Kravas, was a veteran of dozens of campaigns. He expected this to take a week at most. It took 6 weeks, and he never reached the capital. Every road was mined. Every clearing the Dravani entered became a kill zone, with fire pouring in from positions they could not see. Every time they sent troops into the marshes to find the humans, the marshes swallowed them. Soldiers disappeared. Patrols walked into ambushes. Supply convoys exploded. Communications relays went silent in the night. And when Kravos sent teams to repair them, those teams did not come back. The humans struck constantly, at dawn, at dusk, in the rain, in the dark. They appeared from the water and the vegetation like they were part of the landscape, hit hard, and vanished before the Dravani could organize a response. Katie ran her squad through 3 and 4 engagements a day, moving constantly, never staying in one place long enough to be targeted. Andy Novak took up a sniper position on a ridge overlooking a Dravani supply route and spent 2 days picking off officers and communication specialists. By the time the Dravani figured out where he was, he had already moved to a new position 3 miles away. He grinned the entire time. Kravos grew desperate. He sent scout units deeper into the marshes. Most did not return. He requested reinforcements from the hegemony and received a cold response. "Clarify your situation. You outnumber the enemy, 60-1. Kravos replied with 3 words. "Fight them yourself." In the 3rd week, the Dravani launched an armored push toward a cluster of Kiva villages near the southern marshes. Katie got the warning from a Kiva scout and moved her squad to intercept, but the Dravani were moving fast, and the villages were exposed. Andy volunteered to hold a narrow bridge that was the only approach to the villages. Katie told him no. Andy looked at her with steady eyes and said, "Sarge, I can hold that bridge for 20 minutes. That is enough time to get those people out." Katie stared at him. She wanted to say no again. She wanted to order him back in line. But she could hear the Dravani armor grinding through the mud, and she could see the Kiva civilians in the village behind them. Parents holding their children. Elders who could not move fast enough. 20 minutes, she said. That is an order. Andy held the bridge for 23 minutes. He stopped 4 armored vehicles and over 100 Dravani infantry. 46 Kiva civilians made it to safety because of those 23 minutes. Katie found him when the fighting was over. He was sitting against the bridge railing, with his rifle across his lap, and a pre-expression on his face that was almost peaceful. The plasma burns had been too much. He was 20 years old, and he was gone. She held his hand and sat with him for a while. She did not cry then. That came later, alone in the dark, where nobody could see. The Dravani withdrew after 6 weeks. They had lost over 30,000 soldiers. The humans had lost 412. Every name was read at a memorial service on the wet grass of Kiva Prime, with Kiva civilians standing alongside human soldiers in the mist. Katie wrote to Andy's family afterward. She told them he was brave and kind and funny, and that he had saved 46 people who were alive because of him. She did not tell them about the bridge, about the 23 minutes, about sitting with him in the quiet afterward. Some things were too heavy for a letter. The galaxy took notice. Intelligence analysts from a dozen species compiled their reports and reached the same conclusion. The Tarani analyst put it most bluntly in a footnote at the end of her briefing. These are still their regulars, confirmed through multiple independent channels. Standard infantry, not elite, not special operations, regulars. The Tarani Military Council read that footnote, and nobody spoke for a very long time. The Galactic Diplomatic Summit on Fessin Station was supposed to be about trade routes. That was what the official agenda said. Tariff adjustments, shipping lane disputes, mining rights in 3 contested systems. Boring, necessary routine work that kept the galaxy running. Nobody talked about trade routes, not in the private meetings, not in the whispered conversations in hallways, not in the encrypted messages that flew between delegations at all hours of the station's artificial night. Everybody talked about humans. Ambassador Vrelis of the Tarani Concord had been thinking about it for months. He had read every report, every analysis, every scrap of intelligence his people had gathered, about the battles at Harkins Ridge and Kiva Prime. He had run the numbers himself, late at night in his quarters, using his species' most advanced military modeling software. Every simulation told him the same thing. What the humans had done should not have been possible. 400 soldiers holding off 40,000. 3,000 soldiers defeating 200,000 in a swamp. These were not the results of lucky breaks or terrain advantages. These were the results of something fundamental about the species itself, something the models could not account for, because no other species had it. Vrelis called a closed session, senior diplomats only, from the 12 major species. No humans invited. He stood at the center of the circular chamber, his elongated body tense, his 4 eyes blinking in the rapid sequence that meant deep anxiety among the Tarani, and he said the thing that everyone had been thinking, but nobody had been willing to say out loud. The soldiers who fought on those worlds were their regulars, standard troops. We have confirmed this beyond any doubt. The question we must now ask, the question I believe we are all afraid to ask, is this: what are their special forces? What do the humans keep in reserve for when the regulars are not enough? The chamber went silent. 12 species, 12 delegations, and not one of them had an answer. Grace Dunlap was not in that room. She was the human ambassador to the Galactic Commons, and she had not been invited to the closed session. But Grace was a careful woman who paid attention to details, and she had good people working for her. She knew the meeting was happening. She knew what they were discussing, and she knew that the question Vrelis was asking was exactly the right question. She just was not sure the galaxy was ready for the answer. Back on Earth, General Sam Prescott sat in his office at Terran Defense Command and read the intelligence intercepts from Fessin Station with a cup of coffee going cold on his desk. He was 58, gray-haired, and had the weathered look of a man who had spent too many years carrying too much responsibility. He had commanded troops on 4 different worlds. He had written letters to the families of soldiers who did not come home. He understood war not as an idea, but as a weight, and it had bent him without breaking him. "They are asking the question," he said to Colonel Diane Marsh, his chief of staff. She sat across from him, compact and sharp-eyed, with short auburn hair and a mind that worked faster than most computers. She had a reputation in the military for being the smartest person in any room, and the reputation was deserved. "Good," Diane said. "Maybe it will keep them from doing something stupid." Or it will scare them into doing something stupid, Sam replied. Fear makes people unpredictable. Humans are not people to them. Sam looked at her. That is the problem. It was the core of the misunderstanding, the thing that the other species could not grasp, no matter how many reports they read or simulations they ran. Most galactic civilizations treated war as a specialized activity. The Dravani had a warrior caste. The Terrani had professional armies drawn from a small percentage of their population. The Vrlani had automated defense systems and rarely put living soldiers in the field at all. For most species, violence was something that a small, trained group did while everyone else went about their normal lives. Humans were not like that. Every human alive was the product of a species that had spent its entire history fighting. Fighting animals, fighting the weather, fighting disease, fighting each other. For thousands and thousands of years, the ability to fight, to endure pain, to keep going when every rational calculation said to stop, had been the difference between living and dying. It was woven into the species at a level that went deeper than training or culture. It was instinct. The regulars were not remarkable by human standards. They were just ordinary people who had been given weapons and a few months of training and pointed at a problem. The reason they fought so well was not that they were special. It was that every human being carried within them a capacity for violence and endurance that most species simply did not possess. The special forces were what happened when you took that baseline and pushed it as far as it could go. On a classified facility built into a moon orbiting Neptune, a unit called the 1st Terran Special Operations Group was running a training exercise. There were 40 operators in the unit. Their identities were classified at the highest level. Their training pipeline lasted 3 years, and out of every 100 candidates who entered, 6 graduated. The rest washed out, not because they were weak, but because the standard was inhuman. Or rather, it was the most human thing imaginable, the absolute limit of what the species could do. Sergeant Major Chris Langford led the exercise. He was 39, average height, average build, with a face you would forget 5 minutes after meeting him, and pale blue eyes that noticed everything. He had been in special operations for 15 years. His service record was mostly black ink and redacted lines. But the parts that were visible listed deployments to 11 different worlds. The exercise was a simulated assault on a Dravani command fortress. The objective was to infiltrate the facility, eliminate its leadership, destroy its communications, and get out. No support, no backup, no second chances. The time limit was 90 minutes. They finished in 53. Chris gathered his team afterward in the briefing room. 40 men and women who looked at first glance completely ordinary. You could have passed any of them on the street and never looked twice. That was the point. Special Operations did not want people who stood out. It wanted people who could disappear. Sloppy, Chris said. His voice was flat, without emotion. The entry team on the north wall was 2 seconds behind schedule. 2 seconds. In a real operation, that is the difference between a clean breach and a body bag. Nobody argued. Nobody made excuses. They simply nodded and prepared to run it again. Lieutenant Hannah Voigt briefed Chris afterward. She was the unit's intelligence officer, 30 years old, quiet, with dark hair pulled tight and an expression that rarely changed. She had a gift for taking large amounts of messy information and turning it into clear, simple pictures, which was why Chris kept her close. The other species are asking about us, she said, about special operations specifically. They want to know our capabilities. Let them wonder, Chris said. Command has a different opinion, Hannah replied. They want to maintain operational security, but they also want a contingency plan. If the Dravani escalate, or if another major power enters the conflict, Command wants us ready to respond. Respond how? Hannah pulled up a holographic display. It showed a planet, the Dravani homeworld, and deep beneath its surface, a bunker complex. Their high command center, 14 miles underground, 6 divisions of their best troops guarding it. Automated defense systems that have never been breached by any species. Chris studied the display for a long time. He looked at the defenses, the guard rotations, the tunnel networks, the kill zones. Any sane military planner would look at that facility and say it was impossible to breach. You would need a full army just to reach the entrance, and another army to fight through to the command center. Chris was not a military planner. He was something else entirely. "Get me the floor plans," he said. Hannah looked at him. "You think 40 people can get through all of that?" Chris did not smile, because Chris rarely smiled. But something shifted behind his pale eyes. 40 of us got through the simulation in 53 minutes, and that simulation was designed to be harder than the real thing. The real thing has 6 divisions of Dravani soldiers. The real thing has 6 divisions of Dravani soldiers who do not know we are coming, Chris corrected. There is a difference. Hannah held his gaze for a moment, then nodded, and began pulling the floor plans. Somewhere out in the galaxy, on Thesson Station, the diplomats of 12 species were still trying to answer Vrelis's question. They ran models and scenarios and war games. They consulted their best military minds. They studied every scrap of data they had on human combat performance and tried to extrapolate what a human special forces unit might look like. Every model they built was wrong. Not because they overestimated the humans, but because they had no frame of reference for what they were trying to measure. They were trying to predict the capabilities of a predator using the mathematics of prey. They were not ready. None of them were ready. And on the dark side of Neptune's moon, 40 quiet, ordinary-looking humans prepared for the possibility that they would have to show the galaxy exactly what they were. The Dravani hegemony made their decision in the cold halls of their war council, 8 months after their retreat from Kiva Prime. The shame of that defeat sat in their chests like a stone, and shame made them dangerous. They committed 500,000 soldiers across 3 simultaneous offensives, targeting the human colonies of New Cheyenne, Port Sagan, and Delphi's Landing. It was the largest military operation the hegemony had launched in 400 years, and every soldier in the fleet carried the same unspoken order: do not come home without a victory. The galaxy held its breath. 3 fronts, 500,000 Dravani, and on the other side, the humans, just regulars, again. On New Cheyenne, Sergeant Danny Hubbard dug into a mountain pass with his platoon and watched the Dravani landing ships darken the sky like a second sunset. He was 23 now, a year older than Harkin's Ridge, though some mornings he felt like he had aged a decade. The plasma scar on his left shoulder ached in the cold mountain air, and he had a habit of rolling that shoulder before a fight, loosening it, reminding himself it still worked. His platoon was 42 soldiers, holding a pass that was the only route into the colony's central valley. If the Dravani got through, 20,000 civilians had nowhere to go. "Dig in deep," Danny told his people. His voice was steadier now than it had been at Harkin's Ridge. Not because he was less afraid, but because he had learned that fear was just another thing you carried, like your rifle and your pack, and you kept moving with it anyway. "They have to come through this pass single file. That is our advantage. Make every round count." The Dravani hit New Cheyenne with 150,000 troops. Danny's platoon held the pass for 9 days. 9 days of constant fighting, of sleeping in shifts measured in minutes, of eating ration bars with hands that shook from exhaustion. The Dravani threw wave after wave into that narrow gap between the mountains, and every wave broke against 42 stubborn humans who would not move. On the 4th day, Danny's platoon was down to 31. On the 7th day, 24. By the 9th day, when reinforcements finally arrived from the colony's reserve force, There were 18 of them left, filthy and hollow-eyed, and still shooting. A young private who had just arrived at the pass looked at Danny and said, "Sergeant, how did you hold this?" Danny thought about it for a moment. "We did not have anywhere else to be," he said. On Port Sagan, Sergeant First Class Katie Boone was fighting her own war. Port Sagan was a coastal colony spread along the shore of a warm alien sea, and the Dravani came at it from 3 directions. The colony's garrison was 2,000 regulars, under the command of Captain Lou Beckett, a quiet man from Maine who had a talent for defensive planning and a voice that never rose above a conversational tone, even when the sky was falling. On the second day, a Dravani artillery strike hit the command post. Captain Beckett was killed instantly, along with most of his staff. Katie was the senior enlisted soldier still standing, and without hesitation, she stepped into the gap. She gathered the surviving officers and senior sergeants, looked at the tactical display showing Dravani forces closing from 3 sides, and said, "We are going to stop them at the seawall. That is where the ground favors us. Pull everyone back to the secondary line and dig in." It was the right call. The seawall was a natural choke point, and the Dravani could not bring their full numbers to bear against it. Katie organized the defense with the calm efficiency of someone who had been doing this her entire life, even though nothing in her life before the military had prepared her for this. She had grown up in a quiet suburb. She had played softball in high school. She had joined the army because she wanted to travel and see new worlds. Now she was commanding 1,000 soldiers in the defense of an alien beachhead, and she was doing it brilliantly. She led 3 counterattacks personally, not from the back, but from the front, because she had learned at Kiva Prime that soldiers fight harder when they can see their leader fighting beside them. Each counterattack pushed the Dravani back from a section of the perimeter they had nearly breached. Each one cost lives that Katie would carry with her forever. On Delphi's Landing, the 3rd front, another garrison of regulars fought another desperate defense. The details were different, but the story was the same. Ordinary humans, outgunned and outnumbered, refusing to break. The regulars held. On all 3 fronts, against 500,000 Dravani, they held. The cost was severe. Earth mourned. Families received folded flags and letters from commanding officers, and tried to make sense of a grief that felt too large for any single heart to hold. And while the galaxy watched those 3 battles, while every newsfeed and intelligence briefing focused on the heroic stands of human regular troops, something quiet happened. The 1st Terran Special Operations Group deployed. Chris Langford and his 40 operators left the Neptune facility on a stealth ship that did not officially exist. The ship carried no identification, emitted no signals, and was coated in materials that absorbed every form of detection the Dravani possessed. It slipped through the hegemony's border defenses like a whisper through an open window. Hannah Voigt coordinated from the ship's operations center, surrounded by screens that showed real-time intelligence feeds from a network of sources she had spent months cultivating. She tracked Dravani patrol patterns, guard rotations, communication schedules. She mapped every corridor and chamber of the underground bunker from intercepted construction records and seismic surveys. She knew that facility better than the Dravani who built it. "Insertion window in 4 hours," she told Chris. "Entry point is a maintenance shaft on the planet's northern continent. Unmanned, leads to a service tunnel that connects to the main bunker network at level 6. Chris studied the map. 14 miles underground. 6 divisions of guards. Roughly 30,000 Dravani soldiers between the entry point and the command center. Automated turrets, motion sensors, pressure-sensitive floors, sealed blast doors every 500 meters. "How long?" he asked. "If everything goes perfectly, 10 hours. "Nothing ever goes perfectly." 12, then. Chris nodded. He gathered his team in the hold. 40 operators, Some had been doing this for over a decade. Some were on their first real deployment. All of them had the same look. Quiet, focused, utterly still, like coiled springs waiting for release. "You know the objective," Chris said. "No unnecessary kills, no noise. We go in, we reach the command center, we deliver the message, and we come home. Clean and quiet." They inserted at midnight, local time. The maintenance shaft dropped them into the cold stone guts of the Dravani homeworld, and from there, they moved. They moved like nothing the galaxy had ever seen. 40 humans, flowing through 14 miles of tunnels, past guard posts and checkpoints and automated defenses, without raising a single alarm. When they encountered obstacles, they solved them, silently. A guard who turned at the wrong moment was put down before he could draw breath to shout. A sensor array was bypassed with a device Hannah had designed specifically for this mission. A blast door that should have been impenetrable opened to a code that Hannah's intelligence network had extracted from a Dravani engineer's personal files 6 months earlier. 11 hours after insertion, Chris Langford stepped into the Dravani High Command chamber. Alone. His team held the perimeter outside, silent as shadows. The chamber was vast, carved from dark stone, lit by cold blue lights. 12 Dravani generals sat around an oval table, and at the head of that table sat Supreme Commander Torvan. He was 9 feet tall and weighed over 600 pounds. He had led the hegemony's military for 30 years and had personally killed dozens of enemies in combat. He was, by any measure, one of the most dangerous beings in the galaxy. He looked at Chris, a single human, standing in the doorway of the most secure room on the most heavily defended planet in the hegemony, and for a moment, neither of them moved. "You are one human," Torvan said, "in the heart of my world." "I am not alone," Chris said. His voice was calm, easy, like they were old friends having a conversation over drinks. 40 of us walked through your defenses. We are in your command center. We have placed charges on your communication arrays, your power grid, and your defense systems. We are not going to detonate them. That is a choice. I want you to understand that it is a choice. Torvan's massive hands gripped the edge of the table. The stone cracked under his fingers. The soldiers who beat your legions on Harkin's Ridge, on Kiva Prime, on New Cheyenne, and Port Sagan, and Delphi's Landing, Chris continued, those were our regulars. Common troops, ordinary people. He paused and let the silence fill the room. We are not ordinary people. The fear that crossed Torvan's face was not the fear of a coward. It was the fear of a warrior who has just realized that the rules of the game have changed, that everything he thought he understood about his enemy was incomplete, and that the gap between what he knew and what was true might be large enough to destroy his entire civilization. We are leaving, Chris said. Think about what happened here. Think about what it means. He turned his back on 12 Dravani generals and the most powerful military commander in the hegemony, and he walked out. Just walked the way a person walks when they know with absolute certainty that nothing in the room behind them is a threat. 40 operators exfiltrated the Dravani homeworld without a single casualty. 3 days later, the Dravani hegemony requested a ceasefire. The ceasefire negotiations took place on Thesson Station, in the same hall where months earlier the galaxy's diplomats had sat in a closed room and asked each other what human special forces could do. Now the question had been answered, not with words, but with 40 ghosts who had walked through the most heavily defended fortress in the galaxy and walked out again without a scratch. Ambassador Grace Dunlap led the human delegation. She wore a plain gray suit and carried no notes. She did not need them. She had spent 3 decades in diplomacy, and she understood something that most diplomats never learned. The most powerful thing you could do at a negotiating table was listen. So she listened. Across the table sat the Dravani delegation, led by a diplomat named Sevan. He was small for a Dravani, barely 7 feet tall, with careful eyes and a measured way of speaking that set him apart from the blunt military officers his species usually sent to these things. Supreme Commander Torvon had chosen him personally. The message from Torvon had been brief. Send someone who knows when to bend. I have spent too long being rigid, and it has cost us everything. The terms took 3 days to finalize, though both sides knew the shape of the agreement from the first hour. The Dravani would withdraw from all contested territories. They would pay reparations to the 3 colonies they had attacked, enough to rebuild what had been destroyed and support the families of those who had been killed. They would formally recognize human sovereign space and agree to a mutual non-aggression pact with a minimum duration of 50 years. In exchange, humanity would not release the details of the Special Operations mission to the galactic public record. The specifics of what Chris Langford and his team had done inside the Dravani homeworld would remain classified. The hegemony could save face. They could tell their people that the ceasefire was a strategic decision, a reallocation of resources, a diplomatic choice, not a surrender, forced by 40 humans who had proven that no wall the Dravani could build was thick enough to keep them out. Grace agreed to these terms without hesitation. She was not interested in humiliation. She had seen enough history to know that humiliated nations did desperate things. She wanted peace, real peace, the kind that lasted because both sides could live with it. Sevon signed the treaty with a steady hand. Then he looked at Grace and said quietly enough that only she could hear, "Your species frightens me, Ambassador." "That is not our intention," Grace said. "I know. That is what makes it frightening." When the formal ceremony was over, Ambassador Vrelis of the Torani Concord requested a private meeting with Grace. She agreed, because she had been expecting it. Vrelis had been the one asking questions about human military capabilities for over a year. He deserved answers, or at least as many answers as Grace was willing to give. They met in a small conference room with a window that looked out on the stars. Vrelis folded his long limbs into a chair, designed for a species half his height, and studied Grace with all 4 of his eyes. "The soldiers on your colony worlds," he said, "the ones who held against the Dravani on 3 fronts. Regulars." "Regulars," Grace confirmed. "And the unit that entered the Dravani homeworld, Special Forces." "1 team from 1 unit," Grace said. "Yes." Vrelis caught the distinction immediately. "1 team. You are saying there are others." "I am saying that what you saw was a single demonstration of a single capability. We have many units, with many different skills and many different missions. The team that deployed to the Dravani homeworld was suited to that particular task. Other teams are suited to other tasks." Vrelis was quiet for a moment. His 4 eyes blinked in a slow, deliberate pattern that Grace had learned to recognize as the Torani equivalent of deep thought. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "You could have let me believe that 1 team was the extent of it." "Because I want to be honest with you," Grace said, "and because I want you to understand something about my species that I think the galaxy has gotten wrong." She leaned forward slightly, not aggressively, but with the gentle intensity of someone who cared very much about being understood. "The soldiers at Harkin's Ridge, the soldiers at Kiva Prime, the men and women who held New Cheyenne and Port Sagan and Delphi's Landing. They were not warriors, not by choice. Danny Hubbard was a hardware store clerk. Katie Boone played softball in high school. Andy Novak was a kid from New Jersey who talked too much and made everyone around him laugh. They were teachers and students and mechanics and parents. They were ordinary people who became soldiers because someone threatened the people they cared about." She paused. "The Special Forces exist because humanity learned, through thousands of years of painful history, that sometimes ordinary courage is not enough. Sometimes you need people who have taken every human capability, every instinct for survival, every ounce of stubbornness and creativity and endurance, and sharpened it to its absolute edge. People who can do the impossible, because the situation demands it. And that is what the galaxy should be afraid of? Vrelis asked. No, Grace said. What the galaxy should understand is that we never want to use them. Every time those people deploy, it means something has gone terribly wrong. It means the talking failed. It means we are desperate enough to send our best into the worst places imaginable. She looked out the window at the stars. The regulars fight because they are asked to. The special forces fight because no one else can. And every single one of them, from the private in the trench to the operator in the bunker, would rather be home. Vrelis considered this for a long time. Your species is strange, Ambassador, he said at last. Grace smiled. Yes, we are. The treaty held. The Dravani hegemony pulled back behind its borders and began a slow, difficult process of reform. The Warhawks in the military council were quietly replaced by pragmatists. Savan was appointed to a new diplomatic post, overseeing hegemony relations with human space, and he proved to be very good at it. The hegemony did not become friendly with humanity, exactly, but they became respectful, which was more valuable and more durable than friendship. The other galactic powers watched and adjusted. Military doctrines were rewritten. Intelligence agencies doubled their efforts to understand human psychology, though most of them kept reaching the same frustrating conclusion. Humans could not be predicted using models built for other species. They were too variable, too adaptive, too willing to do the irrational thing for reasons that made no sense on paper, but made perfect sense in the heart. On Earth, Sergeant Danny Hubbard was honorably discharged 6 months after the ceasefire. He went home to Oklahoma and went back to work at the hardware store. The owner, an old man named Gus, who had run the place for 40 years, shook his hand and said, "Glad you are back, son. Shelf 3 needs restocking." Danny restocked Shelf 3. Some days, his shoulder ached. Some nights he woke up in the dark and did not know where he was for a few terrible seconds. But he was alive, and the people he had fought for were alive. And the sun came up over Oklahoma every morning, just like it always had. Katie Boone stayed in the service. She was promoted to first sergeant and assigned to a training command, where she spent the next decade shaping new soldiers. She was tough and fair, and she remembered every soldier she had ever lost. She kept a photograph of Andy Novak on her desk, a picture of a lanky kid with a goofy grin, and every class of new recruits heard his name. Private First Class Andy Novak, she would tell them, 20 years old, held a bridge on Kiva Prime for 23 minutes so 46 civilians could get to safety. He was funny and annoying and brave. And he is the reason you are going to take your training seriously, because someday the people depending on you are going to need you to be as good as he was. Nobody ever laughed during that speech. Chris Langford retired from Special Operations 2 years after the Dravani mission. His service record remained almost entirely classified, and that was fine with him. He did not need anyone to know what he had done. The knowing would not have helped him sleep, and it would not have undone the things he had seen. He bought a small house in Vermont, near a lake, and he spent his mornings fishing. He was not very good at it, which he found restful. After 15 years of doing things that required absolute precision and zero margin for error, there was something deeply satisfying about an activity where failure meant nothing worse than an empty hook. Hannah Voigt transferred to Terran Intelligence and rose through the ranks until she was one of the senior analysts responsible for galactic threat assessment. She was brilliant at her job because she understood that the best intelligence work was not about finding threats, but about preventing them. She kept a small sign on her desk that read, "The best war is the one that never happens." Grace Dunlap served as ambassador for another 12 years. She negotiated 9 major treaties, prevented 3 potential conflicts through quiet diplomacy, and was widely considered the finest ambassador humanity had ever produced. Journalists asked her big questions, and she gave them small, careful answers that somehow contained more truth than most speeches. One journalist asked her what humanity's greatest weapon was. Grace thought about it for a long time. She thought about Danny Hubbard in a trench on Harkins Ridge, scared and firing anyway. She thought about Katie Boone holding a perimeter on Port Sagan because someone had to. She thought about Andy Novak on a bridge on Kiva Prime, 20 years old and giving everything he had. She thought about Chris Langford walking calmly through the heart of an enemy empire with nothing but his training and the quiet knowledge that the people back home were counting on him. Empathy, she said finally. We fight so hard because we care so much about each other, about the people we protect, about the future we want to build. Every soldier I have ever known fought not because they wanted to hurt someone, but because they wanted to keep someone safe. That is the engine that drives all of it. The regulars, the special forces, the whole stubborn, messy, beautiful human effort. The journalist wrote that down and then asked, and if that empathy were gone, if someone took that away? Grace looked at him. She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was soft, but her eyes were not. Then you would have a species with all of our strength and none of our restraint. You would have something that fights not to protect, but simply to destroy. And I do not think there is anything in this galaxy that could stop that. She smiled, and the smile did not quite reach her eyes. So let us all be very grateful that we care. Out in the galaxy, on 100 different worlds, the story of humanity spread and settled into the collective memory of 1,000 civilizations. The species that had crawled out of the mud of a small blue planet and fought its way to the stars. The species whose common soldiers terrified empires, and whose special forces were something the galaxy could barely comprehend. And in a hardware store in Oklahoma, a young man with a scar on his shoulder helped a customer find the right size of bolt, and smiled when the sun came through the front windows, and was glad, quietly and completely glad, to be home. The Dravani hegemony had ruled its corner of the galaxy for 6,000 years. No species had ever beaten them in open war. Their soldiers stood 8 feet tall, wore armor that could stop most weapons, and carried plasma lances that cut through steel like butter. When they invaded a world, that world fell. It was simple. It was the way things had always been. So when the Dravani turned their eyes toward the small human colony on Harkins Ridge, nobody in the galaxy expected anything interesting to happen. The colony had 12,000 civilians, mostly farmers and engineers, who had come to build a new life on a quiet world at the edge of human space. They had no warships in orbit. They had no planetary defense grid. What they had was a garrison of 400 soldiers from the 9th Terran Infantry Division. Regulars, not elite troops, not special forces. Just ordinary men and women who had signed up, gone through 14 weeks of basic training, and been shipped out to the frontier because somebody had to stand guard. Corporal Danny Hubbard was one of them. He was 22 years old, from a small town in Oklahoma, and before enlisting, he had spent 2 years working at a hardware store. He was not particularly tall or strong. He did not have any special skills. He was just a guy who had wanted to do something that mattered, and the recruiter at the strip mall had made the infantry sound like it would give him that chance. Now he was crouching behind a wall of sandbags, watching 12 Dravani dropships burn through the atmosphere like falling stars, and he was fairly certain the recruiter had left a few things out. How many did Intel say? Asked Private Lisa Greer from beside him. She was barely 20, with freckles and red hair that she kept stuffed under her helmet. She had been a college student 6 months ago. She had joined up because her student loans were crushing her, and the military offered to pay them off. 40,000, Danny said. Lisa stared at him. 40,000 against 400? Yeah. That is not great, Danny. No, it is not. Sergeant Pete Moran dropped into the trench beside them. He was 34, stocky, with a square jaw and eyes that always looked tired. He had been in the infantry for 12 years, which made him the old man of the platoon. He carried himself with the calm patience of someone who had seen enough trouble to know that panicking never helped. "Listen up," Pete said. "Colonel Harding just got off comms with command. Evacuation transports are 72 hours out. Our job is to hold the perimeter until every civilian is on a ship. That is the only thing that matters. Not glory, not winning, not proving anything. We keep those people alive for 3 days." "Sarge," Lisa said, "there are 40,000 of them." Pete looked at her. "Then I guess we better not miss." The Dravani hit the perimeter at dawn. They came in a massive wave, thousands of soldiers pouring across the open ground toward the colony's outer defenses. Their commanders had studied human capabilities and concluded that a small garrison of regular troops would break under the weight of a full assault. Every other species in the galaxy would have. The Tarani would have surrendered. The Kiva would have fled. The Vrlani would have negotiated. The humans opened fire. Danny's rifle kicked against his shoulder as he fired into the advancing wall of Dravani soldiers. The first few fell, and the ones behind them stepped over the bodies and kept coming. He fired again, and again, and again. Beside him, Lisa was calling out targets in a steady voice that did not match the terror in her eyes. Down the line, other soldiers were doing the same thing, pouring fire into the advancing enemy with the grim determination of people who had nowhere to run and no intention of quitting. Pete moved up and down the trench, calm as a man walking through a park. He dragged a wounded soldier to cover, redistributed ammunition from a dead man's pouches, and plugged a gap in the line by shoving a supply clerk into a firing position and handing him a rifle. "Point that end at the bad guys," Pete told him. "Pull the trigger until it clicks." The Dravani kept coming. They hit the outer wall, and the fighting turned close and ugly. Danny saw a Dravani soldier, 9 feet of muscle and armor, climb over the sandbags and swing a plasma lance at Private Torres beside him. Danny shot it in the neck, the one gap in its armor that basic training had drilled into his memory. The Dravani fell. Danny shot them too. By midday, the ground in front of the perimeter was covered with Dravani dead. 3,000 of them. The hegemony forces pulled back to regroup, and Danny sat against the sandbag wall with shaking hands and a rifle barrel that was almost too hot to touch. "They will come again," Pete said, passing out water and ration bars. His voice was calm, but Danny could see the tightness around his eyes. They had lost 60 soldiers in the first assault. 60 out of 400. They could not take many more mornings like that. The Dravani did come again, that afternoon, and again the next morning, and again that evening. Each time the humans met them with fire and stubbornness, and a refusal to give ground that the Dravani had simply never encountered before. The hegemony commanders reviewed their data and concluded they must be facing a disguised human elite unit, perhaps their famous Marines, or one of their ranger battalions. No regular troops could fight like this. But they were wrong. These were regulars. Hardware store clerks and college students, and people who had joined up because they did not know what else to do with their lives. They were scared and tired and bleeding, and they held the line anyway. On the third day, the evacuation transports broke through, and the civilians began to load. Pete organized the fighting withdrawal, pulling soldiers back section by section while maintaining fire on the Dravani. Danny carried a wounded soldier over his shoulder for the last half-mile to the landing zone. Lisa kept firing from a rearguard position until Pete physically grabbed her and dragged her onto the last transport. When the ships lifted off, 400 soldiers had become 161. Danny had a plasma burn across his left shoulder that would scar permanently. Lisa had lost hearing in one ear. Pete had blood on his uniform that belonged to at least 4 different people, none of it his own. but every single civilian was on those transports. Every one. 12,000 people who were alive, because 400 ordinary humans had decided that 3 days of hell was a price worth paying. When the after-action report reached the Galactic Commons, the alien diplomats read the numbers and did not speak for a long time. 400 against 40,000. 72 hours. A complete civilian evacuation. Ambassador Vrelis of the Tyranny Concord sent a message to the human diplomatic mission. We wish to understand. The soldiers at Harkin's Ridge, they were your elites, yes? Your special warfare units. Ambassador Grace Dunlap read the message, leaned back in her chair, and smiled. No, she replied. Those were regulars. She let the silence do the rest.